Fiendfyre Outbreak. Fiendfyre is one of the most volatile and uncontrollable spells in the wizarding world, an inferno that behaves less like normal flame and more like a living hunting creature. Most fans recognize it from the Room of Requirement, where Crabbe's miscast curse exploded into serpents, dragons, and towering beasts made of fire. That moment wasn't cinematic exaggeration, it was a faithful depiction of Fiendfyre's true nature, a magical blaze that grows stronger, smarter, and more aggressive the longer it burns. A Fiendfyre outbreak occurs when this fire feeds on surrounding enchantments. Wards, structural charms, and even remnants of old spells become fuel, allowing the blaze to surge up walls, bend around obstacles, and form new fiery creatures far beyond the caster's intent. In historical accounts, Fiendfyre has melted stone, cracked castle foundations, and consumed entire libraries of enchanted tomes. Once the spell begins absorbing ambient magic, its shape becomes increasingly erratic and dangerous, shifting unpredictably as the fire interprets everything in its path as prey. The catastrophic part is simple. Almost nothing can stop Fiendfyre once it reaches full intensity. Water charms evaporate instantly, shielding spells buckle under the heat, freezing enchantments only slow individual heads of the blaze. The fire burns until its own unstable magic finally collapses, usually after destroying everything around it. Because of this, Fiendfyre is classified as an absolute last resort curse, so uncontrollable that even most dark wizards refuse to cast it. Temporal Meltdown. Time turners are some of the most delicate magical devices ever created. In Prisoner of Azkaban, we see how even a controlled loop, the kind Hermione used for her classes, requires strict precision. The magic doesn't simply send someone back. It anchors the witch or wizard to a repeating slice of time, holding multiple versions of the same person in coexistence without letting those threads collide. A temporal meltdown occurs when those threads begin to weaken, overlap, or contradict one another. Historically, these meltdowns often begin with something small, a duplicated caster moving unpredictably, a ward interfering with the loop's boundaries, or two time turners operating in close proximity. Once the anchors destabilize, the timeline tries to reconcile conflicting versions of events. Objects may flicker between states, clocks can reverse or skip seconds, and spells cast in one loop might appear in another. During the Department of Mysteries battle, shelves of time turners were shattered, and eyewitnesses reported seeing time distort around them, moments repeating, reversing, or freezing entirely before collapsing back into sequence. The danger escalates if the loop continues running after it destabilizes. The magic tries to correct itself by compressing or erasing contradictory actions, causing patches of local reality to skip, blur, or vanish. When multiple loops collapse at once, entire minutes or hours can be wiped clean. This unpredictability is why the Ministry eventually destroyed every remaining functional time turner. Once a meltdown begins, no counterspell can restore stability, and the timeline repairs itself only by erasing whatever it cannot reconcile. Splinching Disaster. Apparition is one of the most dangerous forms of magical travel, and we get a clear demonstration of its risks in Deathly Hallows, when Ron loses a chunk of his arm during a high-stress escape. Splinching happens when the caster's mind, destination, and physical form fall out of alignment, but a splinching disaster is far worse. It involves multiple witches and wizards attempting apparition under unstable magical conditions, causing dozens of bodies to tear, fragment, or reappear incorrectly across a wide area. These incidents usually begin when something interferes with the destination lock that apparition relies on. Strong wards, experimental long-distance jumps, or conflicting enchantments can distort the magical coordinates mid-transfer. When that lock falters, the caster's body stops reconstructing cleanly. In historical cases, entire groups have reappeared with misplaced limbs, half-formed torsos, translucent organs, or missing structural components. Some individuals materialized only partially inside walls or floors, frozen in place by incomplete reconstruction. The event becomes catastrophic when multiple apparition attempts fail simultaneously. Each misjump leaves behind magical residue, stray fragments of the caster's essence, which further disrupts local space and increases the failure rate for anyone attempting to follow. Ministry reports describe scenes where healers struggled to stabilize victims while the air around them rippled with the lingering aftershocks of misaligned magic. This is the reason apparition licenses exist. Long-range travel experiments were banned, and younger students are kept far from the technique. Once spatial interference begins, even skilled wizards can lose physical cohesion in seconds. Basilisk Exposure. The danger of a basilisk isn't just limited to its direct gaze. In Chamber of Secrets, every student who was petrified, Colin, Justin, nearly headless Nick, Hermione, was struck by a reflected or indirect version of that deadly magic. What the film shows subtly is actually a core part of basilisk lore. Its eyes project a magical field so potent that mirrors, camera lenses, and water surfaces can carry weakened but still dangerous versions of the curse. A Basilisk Exposure catastrophe occurs when those reflections multiply beyond control. These events typically begin in enclosed environments, dungeons, corridors, tunnels, or chambers layered with moisture or shining surfaces. Each reflection fragments the basilisk's visual field, bouncing it around corners and through unexpected angles. In historical accounts, exposure spreads like a chain reaction. One student freezes mid-stride, another collapses at the far end of a hallway, and a third is found clutching a reflective object that inadvertently carried the curse. Even indirect sightings hit fast enough to incapacitate large groups within seconds. The catastrophe becomes far worse when the environment itself amplifies the effect. Pools of water, polished stone, enchanted glass, or even magical artifacts can scatter the basilisk's gaze, creating a web of secondary and tertiary reflections. Defensive charms provide limited protection. They can shield individuals, but they cannot stop the magic from spreading across surfaces. Because no reliable counter-curse exists for an active basilisk gaze network, the only safe response is full evacuation or elimination of the creature. This is why basilisk breeding is illegal worldwide and why any suspected exposure is treated as a top-tier magical emergency. Dementor Breach. Dementors are terrifying enough when there are only a few of them. The lake scene in Prisoner of Azkaban shows how quickly they can drain warmth, joy, and willpower from anyone nearby. But a Dementor Breach is far more severe. It occurs when the containment wards designed to confine these creatures fail, allowing a concentrated swarm to move freely across an area. Unlike most magical beings, Dementors respond less to physical boundaries and more to emotional pressure zones, meaning their influence expands rapidly once restraints weaken. In a breach, the effects intensify layer by layer. Each Dementor projects an aura of despair, and when dozens gather, these auras stack into a suffocating mass of psychological pressure. Temperatures drop suddenly. Light dims unnaturally. Victims begin experiencing memory erosion and intrusive thoughts long before the creatures physically approach. Historical accounts describe entire villages falling into emotional shock, unable to speak or move as the swarm drifted overhead. Even fully trained aurors can struggle to keep their footing once the despair field thickens. The catastrophe escalates when the breach becomes mobile. Dementors move with eerie coordination, drifting along paths of emotional disturbance rather than physical geography. A single failed ward can lead to creatures spreading across forests, coastlines, and even urban towns before a response team arrives. The only true defense, a strong Patronus, is difficult for most witches and wizards to cast under extreme emotional distress. This imbalance between the creature's influence and the average wizard's defensive ability is why the Ministry ultimately severed ties with Dementors and relocated them far from populated regions. Hex Superstorm. Weather-altering charms appear harmless in isolation. A gentle breeze from a wand flick, a cloud-summoning incantation, or a controlled temperature shift. We see mild versions of these enchantments around Hogwarts during Quidditch matches and seasonal transitions. But when multiple weather spells interact in the wrong conditions, they can fuse into something far more volatile. A Hex Superstorm forms when atmospheric magic becomes overloaded with contradictory instructions, creating a magical storm system that behaves nothing like natural weather. These events usually begin with overlapping charms cast by different witches and wizards, each altering humidity, pressure, wind, or temperature in competing ways. In rare historical incidents, dueling wizards have unintentionally created swirling masses of magically charged clouds, where lightning refuses to strike the ground and instead lashes out at enchanted objects. Once the storm gains momentum, spells cast within its radius can warp unpredictably. Levitation charms pull sideways, fire spells dissipate into sparks, and shielding enchantments vibrate under the pressure of unstable magical air. The catastrophe intensifies when the storm's magical core stabilizes into a self-sustaining pattern. At this stage, the weather no longer responds to counter-charms. Attempts to halt the winds may strengthen the lightning. Efforts to clear the clouds may deepen their color and density. Reports from past superstorms describe days of unnatural darkness, flying brooms thrown off course by invisible currents, and rainfall infused with magical residue that reacted with enchanted objects. Because intervention often makes conditions worse, authorities rely on evacuation and containment rather than direct confrontation. This is why large-scale weather magic is tightly regulated and taught only under controlled supervision. Core reaction. Every wand core has a distinct magical pulse. Ollivander hints at this in the first film, explaining how Phoenix Feather, Unicorn Hair, and Dragon Heartstring each produce their own temperament and responsiveness. Normally, the wand chooses the wizard based on compatibility between these magical signatures. But during older wand lore experiments, long before modern safety standards, researchers attempted to combine multiple core materials into a single wand. A core reaction catastrophe occurs when these incompatible magical pulses collide. Historical accounts describe wands that vibrated violently the moment spells were cast. their internal cores fighting one another for dominance. Imagine the steady, fluid magic of a unicorn hair being forced to coexist with the aggressive volatility of a dragon heartstring. Each core tries to shape the same spell in a different direction. When these impulses clash, the wand can't stabilize the spell. Instead, the magic rebounds inward, heating the core and twisting the enchantments that bind it together. In extreme cases, wands have been known to buckle, crack, or erupt into sudden bursts of uncontrolled spell energy. These reactions grow worse under emotional strain or high-intensity casting. One recorded incident describes a wizard attempting a simple, stunning spell, only for the wand to unleash a shockwave strong enough to destroy the surrounding room. Another case involved a core hybrid that distorted spells into the wrong effects entirely. Charms turned into sparks, transfiguration spells melted into raw magical discharge. Because even slight variations in wood, environment, or caster emotion can trigger instability, modern wand makers abandoned hybrid core projects entirely. Wandcraft remains grounded in compatibility, not experimentation, ensuring no wizard risks holding a volatile magical engine in their hand. Vow reversal. An unbreakable vow is designed to enforce a single, irreversible magical commitment. Failure to honor the agreed terms results in instant death. The spell works by binding two magical signatures together, creating a stabilized contract that monitors future actions for violations. A vow reversal catastrophe occurs when an external enchantment, usually a protective ward, countercurse, or environmental disruption, interferes with the vow's monitoring mechanisms. Instead of detecting only the intended conditions, the magic misreads neutral actions as breaches, triggering lethal backlash without an actual violation. The instability becomes dangerous when layered enchantments distort the vow's interpretive logic. Strong defensive barriers like ancestral wards or anti-tampering fields can cause the vow to misalign its magical pathways. Once misalignment begins, the spell attempts to correct itself by reinforcing the binding threads, tightening their grip on both participants. This can lead to involuntary magical constriction, draining the caster or witness and forcing the contract to collapse inward. In severe cases, the vow has been known to detonate outward as raw magical discharge when it fails to reconcile contradictory inputs. This kind of failure is especially feared because the unbreakable vow carries no built-in stabilizers. Its design assumes a simple, uncompromised environment where no competing enchantments interfere with the binding threads. When cast in complex or magically saturated locations, those assumptions break down, and neither participant can halt the reversal once it begins. The irreversible nature of the spell is what makes catastrophic misfires impossible to correct and why most responsible practitioners refuse to cast vows outside controlled conditions. Ward collapse. Protective wards are some of the most complex enchantments in the wizarding world. During the Battle of Hogwarts in Deathly Hallows, we see shimmering layers of magic forming a dome over the castle, a visual glimpse of how these barriers stack, interlock, and reinforce one another. A ward collapse catastrophe takes place when those layers begin to fail in the wrong sequence. Instead of breaking outward and dispersing, the magic folds inward, dragging hostile forces directly into the area it was meant to defend. Most collapses start with small fractures, a crack in the barrier, a flicker in a shielding rune, or a sudden imbalance in the magical anchors tied to the walls, towers, or surrounding ground. Wards aren't singular spells, they're webs of enchantments connected to physical structures. When the structure shifts, ages, or takes damage, the web becomes strained. In older magical locations, especially places with centuries of layered protection, even minor disruptions can cause the entire network to stutter. Accounts from ward breakers describe moments where the magic shudders, briefly exposing the protected space before sealing again. A catastrophic collapse occurs when these failures chain react. Instead of releasing pressure outward, the ward inverts and pulls ambient magic into its center. Defensive charms twist into destructive energy, collapsing corridors, shattering enchantments, and overwhelming anyone trapped inside. If the ward includes blood-based or ancestral components, the inversion becomes even more violent, as the enchantments attempt to reconcile lineage-based logic while the structure around them breaks apart. Because there is no way to safely reverse a collapsing ward mid-failure, magical authorities regularly audit ancient sites and strongly advise against stacking unchecked protective layers. Once a ward starts folding inward, intervention is nearly impossible. Horcrux Failure. Horcruxes are among the darkest enchantments ever created, and their behavior is most vividly shown in the series through objects like Tom Riddle's diary, the locket, and the diadem. Each one carries a fragment of a soul, alive, aware, and fiercely protective of itself. When Harry stabs the diary with the basilisk fang, the ink bursts like blood. When the locket corrupts Ron, whispers twist his thoughts. These are not normal objects. They're containers of identity, sealed with powerful protective magic. A Horcrux Failure catastrophe occurs when these fragments are placed too close together or exposed to strong magical interference, causing them to resonate violently against one another. This instability begins as competing imprints. Each soul fragment tries to assert dominance, radiating its own magical pressure. If two or more Horcruxes align in the same area, their enchantments push back, creating waves of psychic and magical distortion. Historical speculation suggests that artifacts stored together in heavily enchanted vaults have produced effects like sudden emotional shifts, subconscious intrusions, and objects vibrating uncontrollably as the fragments attempt to expand beyond their containers. Even a single Horcrux can distort the environment, as seen with the locket's influence on Harry, Ron, and Hermione, so multiple fragments magnify this to a dangerous degree. A full Horcrux failure occurs when the protective spells weaken or overlap. The fragments try to grow, stretching beyond their boundaries, and when two expanding identities collide, the result is a violent pulse of dark magic. These pulses can crack stone, rupture wards, and corrupt nearby enchanted items. More dangerously, the psychic backlash can overwhelm anyone in the vicinity with intrusive thoughts or emotional surges. Because Horcruxes are bound to fragmented souls rather than normal curse logic, there is no counterspell or containment method. The only way to stop a failure is to destroy the Horcruxes themselves, a process that typically requires rare substances or magically destructive forces.